Our guest this evening is one of the foremost authorities in Washington on U.S.-Iranian relations. We should be in for a very timely and interesting discussion. He's also one of the strongest advocates of dialogue and engagement between the United States and Iran. Trita Parsi heads the National Iranian American Council, which is a nonprofit organization that he founded to facilitate participation by Iranian Americans in American civic life. And Trita was just telling me that in the Washington area, it's the third largest area of Iranian Americans in the United States, the first two being Northern and Southern California. Trita's own interest in Iran is very personal. He was born there, although he left with his parents when he was 4 years old and grew up in Sweden. He arrived in the United States as an adult, but Iran has remained a focus of his studies and his work. His PhD thesis at Johns Hopkins dealt with Iranian-Israeli relations and became the basis for his first book, published a decade ago, A Treacherous Alliance, about secret dealings among Iran, Israel, and the United States. His second book, A Single Roll of the Dice, examined U.S.-Iranian relations during the initial years of the Obama administration. And now comes his latest work, Losing an Enemy, which, as he says in the preface, is in many ways the third part of a trilogy, although he thought he was done after this book, given the nuclear agreement. But now, who knows? We've got a new administration, and it's hard to see exactly where they're going with U.S.-Iranian relations. But in Losing an Enemy, Trita again delves into the U.S.-Iranian relationship, this time recounting how the nuclear deal was negotiated. Trita had exceptional access to many of those involved in the talks. He was consulted and briefed by U.S. officials throughout the process, and he also maintained frequent contact with Iran's foreign minister. Drawing on these and other primary sources, Trita provides fresh detail and insight about these historic negotiations. But his book is important not only as a detailed history of a major diplomatic breakthrough that has altered the situation in the Middle East, it also offers lessons in why diplomacy succeeded this time in averting potential war and at least stalling development of Iranian nuclear weapons, and how it might serve as a model in resolving future international conflicts. So, ladies and gentlemen, please silence your cell phones if you haven't already, and join me in welcoming Trita Parsi.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bradley. Really tremendous pleasure being back here at Politics and Prose, and thank you all for coming here. As was mentioned, this is my third book, and it's on the same topic. My previous books dealt with the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, particularly the rivalry between the United States and Iran and Israel. But I was hoping that it would be a bit of a different book. The previous books showed how diplomatic opportunities had been systematically missed or even rejected, pushing the situation towards war. But for the third one, we had a triumph of diplomacy, a tremendous achievement that showed what could be achieved when smart policy prevailed over the desire to appear tough. And while it certainly didn't lead to a situation in which we can say that peace was achieved, it did create an opportunity to lose an enemy. But then a certain TV reality show star won the elections in the United States, and I had to rewrite the last chapter of the book. And we're kind of back to where we were before. But if we understand what went right, and we understand that what has gone wrong can be reversed, the opportunity to lose an enemy may still exist. Now, throughout these negotiations, I was in a rather unique situation. I had access to both sides, as was mentioned. I was advising the Obama administration on the nuclear issue, while I also had access to the Iranian side to better understand their perspective. It wasn't unusual that I could be at the White House on a Monday to receive a briefing before a new round of talks, and then end up having a 2-hour private conversation with the Iranian foreign minister only a couple of days later. And this ability to observe the two sides up close gave me the opportunity to understand their fears, their calculations, their motives, and how they were hoping that their strategy would be able to work out. And it gave me an opportunity also to be able to write a book in which I could tell the story of how this achievement actually came about. To tell the story of how this international crisis that was on the brink of war actually was resolved without a single fire being shot. Or as Donald Trump would probably put it, how the worst deal in the world actually was reached. But it's important to recognize that these negotiations and this issue ultimately was not just about the nuclear issue. Its consequences really ranged from war to peace. And it really was about the balance of power in the Middle East. And I think we see that very clearly now, as we see that the deal has worked, yet so many of the problems are still remaining in the Middle East. To better understand this, I want to go back in time and start with the geopolitics. April 2012. In a small city in a European country, a most unusual group of officials and former officials had gathered. There were Iranian ambassadors, as well as one or two of the members of the Iranian negotiating team, US officials, including several US generals, and there were also Israelis, very senior ones, in the room. And at a time when Israel and Iran didn't even talk to each other or recognize each other's existence, this truly was a rather unique moment. But what was even more unique, or perhaps shocking, was not who was in the room, but what was actually being said. This is not about enrichment. It was never about enrichment. The room was completely silent as this senior Israeli official looked across the room straight into the eyes of the Iranians and uttered these words. For 2 decades, the Israelis had insisted that Iran's nuclear program, and particularly its enrichment of uranium, constituted an existential threat to Israel. The Israelis and the United States insisted that no solution could be found unless Iran completely ceased its enrichment activities, the so-called zero enrichment objective. But now, this Israeli official in front of the Iranians were saying that the many threats of war and threats by Israel to take military action actually did not have anything to do with Iran's nuclear program. Instead, he continued, Israel needed to see a sweeping attitude change on the side of the Iranians. Israel could not accept that Iran was questioning its legitimacy and its right to exist. And it could not accept that the United States would strike a deal with Iran, a nuclear deal that would, in many ways, end Iran's isolation, because that would leave Israel abandoned in order to meet Iran's hostility on its own without the full support of the United States. Israel could not allow the United States to come to terms with Iran without Iran coming to terms with Israel. That was the message. And if the United States were going to go in this direction, Israel could not accept this, and it would do everything in its power to stand in the way of such a deal. It was a moment of tremendous honesty, but also utmost clarity. To better understand why the Israelis were making this argument, we have to go back another 2 decades, till 1991, 1992. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Iraq had been defeated in the Persian Gulf War by the United States and a UN coalition. This created a new geopolitical situation, both regionally and globally. On a global level, the United States was now the sole superpower of the world. On a regional level, the previous balance of power had changed, but it was not yet clear exactly what it would be replaced with. With Iraq defeated, Israel and Iran now emerge as two of the most powerful states in the region. For 2-3 previous decades, despite official enmity, behind the scenes they had been collaborating and enjoyed a secret security relationship. This was driven by the fact that they were facing common security imperatives. Threat from Iraq and a threat from Soviet Union. But with these two threats gone, a new constellation emerged in the region, one in which Israel and Iran emerged as two of the most powerful states and then began viewing each other as potential threats and rivals. It wasn't because of Iran's ideology, because they had already enjoyed a relationship during the 80s in spite of Iran's ideology. It was because of the change in the geopolitical configuration of the region. The Israelis cleverly moved very fast and argued that in order for Israel to be able to make peace and take the risk of peacemaking with the Palestinians, the United States needed to contain and isolate Iran because Iran was now the new threat to the region in the Israeli view. The Clinton administration obliged, and they adopted a policy that was called the dual containment policy. The idea that Iraq and Iran needed to be jointly contained and isolated. Essentially, a new order was established in the region based on the centrality of Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, and based on the prolonged isolation of Iran and Iraq. For the Iranians, this was a major blow. They had collaborated with the United States quietly against Iraq during the Persian Gulf War, and they were hoping that they would be rewarded by coming out of the cold and being able to enjoy an important position in the region again. But instead, the United States doubled down on isolation. And the Iranian response was to spread extremism and target what they viewed was the weakest link in the American strategy, which was the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If that process was sabotaged, essentially the rest of the US strategy would fall apart. As long as the US was seeking an order in the region based on Iran's isolation, Iran was going to make it as costly as possible for the United States to pursue that policy in the hopes that it would cause its collapse. But despite everything the Iranians did, it wasn't the Iranians that succeeded in collapsing that order. It was the United States itself. By George W. Bush invading Iraq and hoping to be able to change that country and other countries in the region to its own liking and establishing an order only based on new and pro-American regimes in the region. The Bush strategy failed miserably, and the invasion of Iraq did not build a new order. It only managed to destroy the previous one. And more importantly, and we're seeing the consequences of this today, the United States weakened itself to the point in which it no longer had the capacity to impose on the region a new equilibrium, a new balance of power. And ever since, we have seen an essentially orderless Middle East. So much of the fighting and the war that is taking place right now is driven by the fact that you have so many vacuums in the region, and the larger nations are vying for influence, fighting each other, perhaps not so much offensively as much as defensively, because they don't want to see the new balance of power being tilted against them, whatever balance that would emerge afterwards. For Israel and Saudi Arabia, this is the important part. The collapse of Pax Americana was a disaster. They were the main benefactors of the previous order. They enjoyed maximum maneuverability under the protection of the United States in the region. For Iran, this was a blessing in disguise. The United States had defeated Saddam, and the United States had removed the Taliban in Afghanistan, two of Iran's main rivals at the time. And in the process, it had weakened itself to the point that it was increasingly difficult for it to uphold a policy of isolating Iran. Instead, what we saw was Iran was unleashed. But as long as the United States continued to refuse negotiations and refused to recognize Iran, the Iranians could not lock in this new favorable geopolitical circumstance. What they needed was a crisis, something that would force the United States to the table and that would enable a negotiation that, by definition, would cause the United States to end its policy of regime change and come to terms with the Iranians. The Iranians wanted this recognition for the very same reasons the Israelis did not want to see Iran get this recognition, because that recognition in and of itself would put an end to decades of American policy of isolating Iran. Now, ironically, the Iranians and the Israelis actually used the same instrument to be able to achieve their objective, which was the Iranian nuclear program. From the Israeli perspective, this menacing program was used to make unrealistic demands, such as the idea that enrichment in Iran had to be completely and entirely ended, and in order to make sure that no compromise could be reached at all. As long as no compromise was reached, what had been defined as an existential threat, the calculation was, would eventually lead the United States towards taking military action against Iran. And the balance of power that would follow the United States attacking Iran would be one that would be favorable to Israel. The Iranians had a different calculation, but with the same instrument. Yes, advancing the nuclear program certainly could lead to war. But precisely because the United States had failed in Iraq and had become so costly, and the American population was so tired of warfare, it could also lead to the United States coming to the table and trying to find some sort of a common ground with the Iranians. The crux for the United States essentially was how to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapons capability without taking military action, without allowing the Israelis to take military action, and without enabling Iran to be in a position to define the new balance of power after negotiations with Tehran. Now, the Bush administration's strategy was to refuse negotiations, insist on zero enrichment, pursue sanctions, and issue threats of war. It was an utter failure. The Iranians had zero enriched uranium when Bush came into power, and they had roughly 150 centrifuges at the time. By the time Bush left office, the Iranians had 8,000 centrifuges and 1,500 or more kilos of low-enriched uranium, enough to be able to build one nuclear weapon. Clearly, a different approach was needed. And then Senator Barack Obama campaigned on the idea of reinstating diplomacy as a central piece of American statecraft, rejecting the Bush doctrine of not negotiating with countries we disagree with. And negotiating with Iran very much became the centerpiece of that platform. But once Senator Obama became President Obama, he discovered rather quickly how difficult diplomacy could be. A first attempt in 2009 ended up failing, mainly because of problems on the Iranian side. And Obama quickly ended up in a situation in which he was stuck with the very same instruments that President Bush had at his disposal: sanctions, sabotage, pressure, and cyber warfare. Precisely because he had tried diplomacy, though, and precisely because he enjoyed international legitimacy in a way that Bush did not, Obama succeeded where Bush could not. He imposed the most striking, hard-hitting sanctions that probably any country has been under yet. Even the Iranian central bank was put under sanctions, which essentially closed Iran's access to the international financial system. The United States succeeded in convincing Europe to cut all oil imports from Iran. Iran exported roughly 40% of its oil to the European Union at the time. The day Congress passed sanctions, imposing sanctions on Iran's central bank, Iran's currency dropped roughly 30%. Riots broke out in Tehran. Iran's GDP shrunk 25% over the course of this time. For a moment, it looked as if capitulation by Iran actually was in the cards. For how long could it truly be able to sustain this amount of pain? The Iranians, without a doubt, had underestimated Obama. They never thought the world would be willing to go along with sanctions in this manner. But Obama had also underestimated Iran. Clearly, it was hurting, but Iran did not break, and nor was it without a response. Just as the Iranians responded to Bush's refusal to negotiate by doubling down on their nuclear program, they responded to sanctions by building more centrifuges. And eventually, what ended up coming out of this was that if the American calculation was that sanctions would cause the Iranian cost-benefit calculus to change and make the Iranians realize that it would simply be too costly and painful for them to go forward with their nuclear program, the Iranian calculation was by just expanding the program as much as possible, it would make the sanctions policy too costly for the United States. Let me give you a quote from President Rouhani's chief of staff. Our strategy was to break the mentality of the other side by showing them that pressure doesn't work. So we escalated our nuclear activities to show what pressure actually would produce. The end result was that the United States inched closer and closer to collapsing the Iranian economy. The Israelis inched closer and closer to taking military action, and the Iranians inched closer to having a nuclear weapons capability. In fact, at one moment, the American side was so worried that the Israelis would take the freedom of launching a surprise attack against Iran, knowing very well that the United States was opposed to it, that Pentagon officials insisted that the moon cycle had to be included in all of the briefings that they received because of their fear that the Israelis would do so and they would need a specific window to be able to successfully strike Iran. As these three clocks were ticking and the official P5+1 negotiations were actually leading nowhere, President Obama was convinced that he needed to set up a secret channel directly to Iran's supreme leader in order to be able to directly negotiate far away from the eyes of the media, in order to better be able to assess how much effect are these sanctions having on the Iranians and are they willing to yield. Thanks to a person who at the time was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, John Kerry, an opportunity existed to use the country of Oman to be able to set up these secret negotiations. Senator Kerry had played an instrumental role in getting 3 Americans who had been wrongfully jailed in Iran released using the help of the Omani government. And the Omanis had proven their ability to get the Iranians to deliver and their ability to actually directly access Iran's supreme leader. So by July 2012, for the first time, a small delegation of American officials traveled to Muscat in Oman, and they meet with the Iranians. The gentleman from the American side was Puneet Talwar and Jake Sullivan, who at the time were mid-level, not much known about them. The Iranians sent 3 individuals. One of them was a deputy foreign minister. Once they saw that the Americans did not have someone at their rank, the deputy foreign minister never entered the room, but instead sat in a different room and observed and conducted negotiations without directly interacting with the Americans. By all accounts, it ended up being a really bad meeting. The US side was there to be able to assess had the Omanis succeeded in actually getting an authoritative channel to Iran's supreme leader in order to be able to see how close were the Iranians to capitulating. The Iranians were there not to capitulate, but to see how close the United States was to capitulating on the issue of enrichment. For the full day, the Iranians were peppering the Americans with various formulations of how the US could come to terms and accept enrichment on Iran. But the US side had absolutely no authority to even discuss that issue. So it was a failure. And then you had the US elections in November of that year, and as a result, nothing could happen. But by January 2013, a new sense of urgency was taking hold of the White House. January 2012, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta had stated publicly that Iran's breakout time was 12 months, meaning that from the moment the Iranians would make a decision that they wanted to build a bomb to actually having a bomb would take roughly 12 months. By January 2013, a year later, the breakout time had shrunk to 8 to 12 weeks as a result of the Iranians quickly advancing their nuclear program and building more centrifuges and amassing more low-enriched uranium. Clearly, the Iranian nuclear clock was ticking faster than the sanctions clock or the Israeli clock. If nothing changed, the United States would soon be in a situation in which it either had to accept acquiesce to an Iranian nuclear weapons capability or go to war. The least likely scenario was that the Iranians would capitulate because time simply was on their side. And as a result, a decision was made to go back to Oman. A new delegation was sent, March of 2013, this time a much larger and a much more senior delegation. It was headed by Bill Burns, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, the equivalent of the gentleman that the Iranians had sent during the first meeting, who came now and directly engaged with the United States. A very different setup was set up. They were, just to give you some context, in the P5+1 meetings that were taking place in parallel, but they had no clue that there were secret negotiations taking place as well. The Iranians insisted that as the other delegations entered the room, they would all have to enter the room, they would all have to sit down, and once they were all seated, the Iranian delegation would come in. And then once the talks were over, and usually it was just a competition of different speeches they were giving to each other, the Iranians would have to stand up first, leave the room entirely before anyone else could leave. Why? To ensure that there would absolutely be no chit-chats on the sidelines, no coffee breaks or anything like that. In Oman, it was a completely different thing. They were broken up in different teams. They were taking walks together. They were trying to create a bit of a personal rapport in order to actually make sure that proper diplomacy could take place. But the most important thing that happened was that this time around, the US negotiators were armed with something they had never been armed with before, the opportunity to play the enrichment card. In very careful terms, they presented to the Iranians the idea that the United States could accept enrichment on Iranian soil given that the Iranians would accept significant restrictions to their program and transparency. This was exactly what the Iranians had waited for more than 10 years. But there was a problem. Because of the tremendous mistrust between the US and Iran, and between Iran and the United States, the Iranians could not go back to Tehran just being able to say that orally they had been promised that the United States would be willing to accept enrichment. They needed it in writing. The US side had absolutely no authority to be able to put this in writing, because the fear was that if they put this in writing, the Iranians would be able to pocket this concession, they would be able to leak it, cause a significant disunity within the P5+1. So once again, the mistrust between the United States and Iran was creating a problem even when on substance they were actually getting much, much closer to each other. So something needed to break. Something was needed in order to be able to bridge the trust gap between the two sides. And that's where Oman stepped in once again. An idea emerged that instead of the United States sending a letter to the Iranians in writing, explaining that under what circumstances they could accept enrichment, a letter would be sent to the Sultan of Oman, a person that both the President of the United States and the Supreme Leader of Iran respected. He would then travel to Iran, which he did in between his chemotherapy, and meet directly, face to face, with the Iranian Supreme Leader, not show the letter, but convey to the Iranian Supreme Leader the content of this letter. And then if the Iranians rejected, it was no longer them rejecting because they didn't trust the United States, but rather they would be insulting the Sultan of Oman. But precisely because they had confidence in the Sultan, and because the United States had confidence in the Sultan, this is what caused the breakthrough to actually happen. I think it's important to note this because right now we hear so much about sectarian strife in the Middle East. We hear about the Sunni-Shia fight. We hear about Arab-Persian divisions. It was actually an Arab country that brought the United States and Iran closer together. Then, after this was settled, both sides got really lucky. Because all of this, mind you, was happening while Ahmadinejad was still president in Iran. 3 months later, Rouhani wins the elections in Iran. He's a person who had been a lead negotiator in the past, brings in a completely different team of negotiators, people who actually lived extensive periods of time in the United States, had tremendous familiarity with many of the Americans in the Obama administration, and a completely different atmosphere is created. And immediately, even though Rouhani had no idea that the enrichment issue already more or less had been resolved, they immediately go to work throughout August in Oman, September in New York, and by November 2013, an interim deal is finally struck. And this interim deal was so critical for the United States because it reversed the time dynamics in which time was on Iran's side. By the Iranians agreeing to completely stop adding new centrifuges, and the United States not adding new sanctions but keeping the previous sanctions, that dynamic in which time was on Iran's side more or less was either neutralized or reversed, which was a huge victory for the US side. Then, after another 18 or so months of excruciating negotiations, by July 2015, they finally had a deal. And it was a deal that showed that diplomacy had prevailed, that war with Iran was prevented, as well as a nuclear weapon in Iran. Throughout these talks, the biggest, or at least the declared enemy, the biggest declared enemy of the negotiations was, of course, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he did quite a lot to harm the talks. There's no doubt about it. In fact, some of it we know because, as you all know, President Obama had a habit of spying on foreign leaders, including friends. And once that was revealed, he stopped. He stopped tapping into Angela Merkel's cell phone, for instance. But he did not stop spying on Netanyahu. And the reason for that was because there was a suspicion that the Israelis were still doing things to harm the negotiations, and it certainly was revealed that they were coordinating with certain members of Congress, and that they were also leaking information that they had been given to them by the US negotiators about the negotiations in order to undermine the nuclear talks. But what is so ironic about this is that in some way, perhaps this deal would not have been reached had it not been for Netanyahu, inadvertently. Because by him making the Iranian nuclear issue an existential issue, he essentially eliminated the status quo option, the kicking the can down the road option. And he did so with the calculation that he would force the United States to take action. And of course, his hope was that it would be military action. Instead, to his surprise, Obama managed to figure out how the United States could take diplomatic action. But had he not eliminated the status quo option, chances are the United States and Obama would actually not have taken diplomatic action, but instead have chosen to just contain the issue, kick the can down the road, and let it be the headache of the next administration. But by eliminating that, he forced Obama to choose between war and peace, and Obama chose peace. But what is perhaps even more ironic is that if he had thought about this a little bit harder, he might have figured out that there was something really simple he could have done to kill the nuclear talks. As you all know, he went to Congress, he blasted the deal, he said it's the worst deal ever. He said that it paves Iran's way to a nuclear weapon. All he needed to do to kill this deal was to go to the microphones and say, "This is a fantastic deal. I love this deal. This deal is so good for Israel. And this is Iran's ultimate defeat and capitulation." This Iranian foreign minister himself told me in these words, that had Bibi hugged the deal, it would have killed the opportunity for the Iranians to continue the negotiations. They had no difficulty dealing with Bibi saying that this is such a defeat for the West. It actually helped shut up the hardliners in Iran. But had he gone out and said that this is fantastic, he would have created massive difficulties for the Iranian negotiators. With all the things he did and all the plans he had, he seemed to not have been able to figure this one out. Now, there's a question as to whether a better deal could have been had. And as you all know, President Trump believes it is the worst deal ever, so clearly there must have been better deals. I think there was a better deal that could be had, but not in 2015. The better deal that could be had was if we had had a more realistic position 10 years ago. 15 years ago. 2003, the Iranians sent a negotiating offer to the Bush administration. At the time, they had, as I mentioned, roughly 150 centrifuges. They offered to open the nuclear program for full inspections and transparency. They offered to come to terms with the US on a whole set of other issues, such as collaborating against al-Qaeda. I found out about the deal because I was working for a member of Congress, and the Swiss ambassador in Iran, who hand-delivered the proposal to the US government, also gave us a briefing and gave us a copy. My boss sent it over to Karl Rove at the White House. He got a phone call back within 2 hours. Rove was intrigued, he said, and he wanted to know if this proposal actually was authentic, if it had the blessing of the supreme leader in Iran. That was the last thing we heard of that proposal until about 2 or so months later. There was an article in the Financial Times that said that some sort of a negotiating offer had been delivered to the US side by the Swiss from Iran, and the US side, the Bush administration's response was to say nothing to the Iranians and reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered it in the first place. 2005, another opportunity. March of that year, the last Iranian offer was sent to the Europeans before elections were held and eventually Ahmadinejad became president. In that proposal, which you can find online, the Iranians offered to cut their enrichment at 3,000 centrifuges. The Europeans didn't even bother to send it to the US side because they knew Bush would reject anything that was above zero. In one of the briefings at the White House during the negotiations, I don't remember who, but someone brought up that proposal and asked the US negotiators what they thought, and they said, well, we would jump on that proposal if it was there today, but we've already missed that boat. We're constantly chasing the deal we could have gotten years ago. At one moment during the talks, I think it was in Lausanne, I asked Zarif about that proposal, because that was before they had managed to decide exactly how many centrifuges Iran would keep. And I said, will it be more than the 3,000 that you were willing to cut your program at in 2005? He smiled and he said, 3,000? That was just the opening bid. We would have settled for 1,000. Now, instead, as a result of this deal and as a result of years of sanctions in which the Iranians responded by building more centrifuges, the Iranians are keeping 5,000 centrifuges. And they have far more knowledge about the nuclear process. That's the alternative cost of just pursuing the combination of pressure tactics and unrealistic objectives. So there was a better deal. It's just not a deal that we could get now. If I could just close off by saying a couple of words of what this means beyond the nuclear issue. What this deal could have done, and almost did, is not just to prevent war and prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons. It paved the way for a regional, all-inclusive dialogue on security issues. Something that would bring the Saudis and the Iranians to the same table to be able to have an all-inclusive security dialogue, figuring out a way to share the region. You can create a new equilibrium in the region, either by going to war or by going to the negotiating table. There really is no other alternatives than that. But what happened when Donald Trump went to Riyadh and called for Iran's all-out isolation again is that he closed that door and he opened up the door for more enmity and for more rivalries that we have seen in the past decades. The opportunity to lose Iran as an enemy essentially existed. And there's a reason why it was so welcomed by the Saudis and the Israelis at the time. Precisely because it would close the door for a potential rapprochement between the United States and because it would open up the door for a potential path for the US and Iran to go to war again. The Saudis, it became quite clear, would have preferred an Iran that has nuclear weapons but is isolated in the region and at odds with the United States than an Iran that doesn't have nuclear weapons but is finding a way to reintegrate itself into the region. From the Israeli side, it was not that terribly different either. As the British foreign minister said at the time in a rather interesting conversation or debate in the British Parliament, he said, Israel wants to keep the West at a permanent state of standoff with Iran. That's preferable to actually reaching a negotiated settlement. Clearly, there are those who fear the idea of America losing Iran as an enemy more than they fear Iran's nuclear program. But as that Israeli official admitted in 2012, this was never about enrichment. Thank you so much. So I'm pleased to take your questions. I think I'm moderating this myself.
Yeah, would you ask?
Yes, and if I could ask everyone to, in order to make sure that you get some airtime on C-SPAN, please step up to the microphone so everyone can hear you. Go ahead, step up.
Thanks very much. I have a question about 2013. You mentioned that the Obama administration was starting to get particularly concerned about Iranian enrichment. Could you talk about whether the desire to keep talks on track had an impact on the administration's decision not to enforce the red line in Syria?
Thank you so much. I know that's an argument that has been presented, that because there was an opening with Iran and because it was starting to show some promise, the Obama administration refrained from enforcing the red line that Obama himself had put up on Syria, fearing that it would impact the nuclear negotiations. Throughout this, I asked almost every side. I found no evidence that that was the reason why Obama didn't do this. In fact, I would take a step back and put these two things next to each other. On the one hand, the idea that if actions had been taken, it would have collapsed the deal. And on the other hand, the broader, clearly set strategy of Obama when it came to the Middle East. His strategy on the Middle East was that he believed that the Middle East had lost a tremendous amount of strategic significance. Already during the first year Obama came in, they'd made an audit. And the conclusion was that the United States is over-committed in the Middle East and under-committed in Asia. And as a result, there's a need to pivot to Asia. The worst thing that could happen was for the United States to get dragged into another war, endless war in the Middle East, because it would prevent the United States from being able to prepare itself from the peer competitor challenge it would get in the next decade or two from China. Because ultimately, as a superpower, the United States is going to have to worry about the potential risk of some other power emerging, challenging America's global position. There's no country in the Middle East that has the capacity to challenge the United States on a global scale. Certainly it's not the Houthis in Yemen, as we're hearing is such a major threat. The one country that does have the capacity, of course, is China. Not getting dragged into another war in Syria, that Obama had no faith in how it would end and what the actual objectives and strategy would be, I found to be far more convincing reason as to why he didn't enforce the red line, rather than thinking that it potentially could have anything to do with the nuclear negotiations. Again, it could be I just did not find any evidence that that was the reason. Thank you.
Moving past the nuclear deal, could you share with us some of your thoughts on what Iran is doing with Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran in Pakistan, the Taliban, etc.?
Thank you. So with Hamas, the relationship has gone up and down quite a lot for the Iranians. The Iranians originally had very bad relations with Hamas. And today, yesterday, the Hamas leader was in Tehran and met with the Iranian foreign minister. The latest big fight they had is because Hamas, of course, is connected to the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is also the core of the opposition to Assad in Syria, at least in the early phases of that war. Iran's relationship with Hamas has never been what its relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon is. Its relationship with Hezbollah in Lebanon goes back several decades. There is a completely different strategic nature to that relationship. I find it extremely difficult that the Iranians would completely cut off Hezbollah, for instance. Its relationship with Hamas has been far more instrumental rather than strategic. But here's the one important thing to understand. An objective of any final negotiation to be able to establish a new equilibrium in the Middle East has to involve that states need to deal with states instead of doing what the Iranians and many others have done, which is constantly trying to find non-state actors and proxies in their competition with other states. That in and of itself weakens the states. And what we're seeing right now is that with weak states in a geopolitical environment like this leads to the collapse of states. And that is a greater threat than almost anything else. But this is not something that just the Iranians are doing. They're just doing it better than almost everyone else. The Saudis have tried doing it quite extensively. The common pattern is that the Saudis find a group, they fund it. It usually is a Wahhabi extremist organization, and within 6 months, that group turns against the Saudis. The Iranians have had their relationships, and there's almost no break between the ones that they have established strategic relationships with. The nature of the game and the rivalry in the Middle East has to change. no state should be able to use this because it in and of itself undermines the state system, which is a threat to everyone in the region.
What about the Taliban? The Iranians and
Oh, okay. So the Iranians and the Taliban almost went to war with each other in 1998. The Taliban were originally supported by the Saudis in part of their competition with Iran. The United States and Iran fought the Taliban together in 2001, under Bush actually. And the Iranians have defined Taliban as one of its main threats for quite some time. What we're seeing now is that there are some signs that that is changing a bit. You probably saw the New York Times article, which I have some question marks around, but nevertheless. I suspect that one of the reasons for this is in Iraq, the Iranians put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi government did not agree to a SOFA agreement with the United States, the Status of Forces Agreement, that would allow the U.S. forces to be in Iraq and be above Iraqi law. Why? Because the Iranians do not want to see any American troops anywhere near its borders. Well, guess what happened in Afghanistan? In Afghanistan, the Afghan government did sign a SOFA, and as a result, the United States is there. And I think part of what the Iranian calculation may be, but I'm speculating here, is precisely because of that. That because the Afghan government, which otherwise does have decent relationship with Iran, and the Iranians have supported because they signed that and they allowed the United States to stay there, and mindful of the fact that US politicians very frequently toy with the idea of doing regime change in Iran, the Iranians do not want to see any US troops on its borders. And I think Afghanistan currently is suffering from the rivalry between the United States and Iran on that issue.
Thank you. One of the things that was repeated a lot during the weeks and months leading up to the successful Iranian deal during the Obama administration was the idea that the Russians were a big help in the negotiations. This was certainly something that John Kerry was saying, and there seemed to be some basis for it. It seems like, if anything, has made the whole world more complicated since the election of Donald Trump has been kind of the whole nature of U.S.-Russia relations. So part of the question is, was Russia a help back in 2016? And does the relationship now between the U.S. and Russia and the uncertainty going forward about the Iranian deal, can you make any comments about whether
Sure.
U.S.-Russia relations are still important in seeing the deal kind of go forward?
Yep.
And was Russia a big help in the past?
Sure. Thank you so much. The question was about the Russian role. I mean, in the context of today, when we hear so much about Russia, it's difficult to fathom that argument was made that Russia was so helpful in the negotiations. And everything I saw, without a doubt, the Russians played a tremendously helpful role in the negotiations. And it was quite surprising to many, very frustrating to the Iranians, that even the Ukraine crisis did not shatter the P5+1 unity that existed between the United States, Russia, and the other countries, presenting a united front. In fact, after the deal, when the deal went to Congress for the Senate and the House to vote for disapproval of the deal, even then the Russians played a tremendous role, because Senator Durbin and Nancy Pelosi invited all members of Congress, at the time I think it was only the Democrats that showed up, to meet with the ambassadors of France, Britain, Germany, and Russia. Because at the end of the day, as much as Trump is saying, I want to walk out of this deal, we have to remember, this is an international agreement between several states. This is not a bilateral agreement between the United States and Iran. And in those meetings, according to the senators that I interviewed on this issue, the Russian ambassador was, by virtue of being a Russian, almost the most convincing ambassador. At the end of the meeting, Senator Durbin looked at all of the senators and said, I want you to take a look at these 4 ambassadors. Remember which countries they're from. And remember the last time you saw these 4 countries coming to you and all saying, this is a good deal and the United States should support it. Had it just been the Europeans, it would have been effective. But the fact that the Russian was there and played that role even after the deal was something that was very surprising to a lot of senators.
So how about going forward?
Well, going forward, I think President Trump is going to find out that being president is very different from running for office. This is an international deal. If he breaks it, and he has telegraphed very clearly that despite the fact that there's been now 6 IAEA reports saying the Iranians are doing what they're supposed to do, they're living up to the agreement, he's clearly stated that he intends to say that they're not living up to the agreement next time that he has to certify this to Congress. He's not going to end up having a fight with Iran. He's going to end up having a fight with the entire P5+1. And this is going to create massive problems. As much as walking out of the Paris Agreement probably has some of the most severe long-term effects for the United States and the globe as a whole, walking out of this agreement will have some very severe immediate effects because of the crisis that it will create.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm curious as to why did Oman choose to take such a role to bring Iran and the U.S. closer? And I'm also more curious about how the GCC allies reacted towards such a role.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The Omanis like to do these kind of things. They like to quietly in the background help resolve problems. And the specific individuals who were involved in this have actually resolved other problems that I am not at liberty of discussing. I was shocked when I found out what they had done. But the core thing was this. At the time, many of the countries in the region either hoped or feared, but were all in agreement this was leading towards a war. The Omanis were on the side of thinking that that would be a disaster. They had the capacity to be able to do something that almost no one else could, precisely because they had that relationship of trust with both sides. And that relationship actually goes back a couple of decades, even before the Islamic Republic. The Sultan actually is in power to large part as a result of an intervention that Iran did in 1973 or 74, I believe it was, during the time of the Shah. There was a rebellion against the Sultan, and Iran sent troops. 700 Iranian troops died for the sake of the Sultan staying in power. Ever since, there's been a very dramatically different relationship between Oman and Iran than that of almost any other of the GCC states. So they had that history, and at the same time, a very trusted American ally. And they had the capacity, and thanks to them proving their ability to get the 3 Americans released from jail, they had proven their ability to be able to help on this issue as well. And Obama from the outset believed that ultimately the Iranians would never yield or give any meaningful compromises or concessions to the US unless it was in a direct negotiation authorized by the supreme leader. And no one was closer than the Omanis to be able to provide that.
And how did the GCC allies react towards that?
Not particularly well.
I'm just curious, why didn't we hear anything about it in the news?
Well, most of them didn't actually know anything about this. This was kept a very, very good secret. And there were either other things that were happening. So, for instance, during some of the negotiations, there were other individuals there, but they were not allowed to be visible. So they entered the hotel rooms using back doors and other things. What we saw as being the official negotiations was, I'm not saying it was a facade, but there was something else going on in the background as well. And the reason for this was very simple. The enemies of this deal were not many, but they were plenty in opportunities and capacity. And most importantly, the negotiations were so fragile that even if they weren't that many, they could create problems. And as a result, these things had to be kept as secret as possible. Remember how surprised you must have been when you woke up that day finding out that there was a rapprochement between Cuba and America. When President Obama went in December of that year and announced that there's been these secret negotiations. Precisely because of the way these issues, both Cuba and Iran, had been politicized here, it was just too difficult to conduct these negotiations in open because there would be too many members of Congress and others who would have a political interest in sabotaging it. And since not a lot of people go to Oman, that was the great place to hold those negotiations.
I would like to compliment you on an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I have 2 questions. They're actually related. One has to do with your own personal experience through the negotiations, if you had a role or of any. And secondly, for somebody like myself who studied the agreement very carefully and realized that much of the quality that will come to Iran with the enrichment capacity and their quality of centrifuges will be very much back-ended in the process. Over the last 5 years of the agreement, they get many, many benefits. There must be an assumption made that behavior will change in the country. It'll become more westernized. And I think I'm relating both your personal experience with your efforts and your comments of Rouhani bringing in a new team, how that may evolve into some improved processes going on in Iran that may make more confidence in those who have doubts in the agreement that they will change behavior in other areas besides the enrichment process.
Sure. Excellent question. Thank you so much. I had no particular role. I was not in the negotiations, but I advised the Obama administration. So that's easy. On the second part, in regards to changing behavior, the entire crux of the issue was Iran is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There were valid suspicions that he had done things that he was not allowed to do. And the question then was, does that mean that Iran gets a permanent punishment? Or does something need to be done in order to ensure that Iran regains the confidence of the international community and afterwards essentially enjoys the same rights that all other countries that are members of the NPT do? If it was to permanently impose a punishment on the Iranians, there would essentially not be a deal. The only way to be able to get a deal is to ensure that at the end of the deal, if Iran has done everything right, Iran should be no different from any other state, because you're not allowed into the NPT because you're as good as Switzerland. You are allowed into the NPT because you abide by the rules of the NPT. If the Iranians are abiding by the rules and they're paying for what they made wrong in the past, then they should be able to be. So the intent then is to make sure that that period is as long as possible so that true confidence can be gained. The Iranians wanted the deal to only last 5 years. The United States originally wanted it to be 20 plus years. It ended up being some aspect lasting 8 years, some aspect lasting 15 years. But the most important aspect, which is the inspections and the verification element of it, is lasting permanently, because the Iranians are going to ratify. Granted that the United States doesn't do anything to kill the deal and Congress does what it needs to do on year 8, then Iran is going to ratify the additional protocol, which means that those elements will become completely permanent. Then the question is there a calculation that there will be an behavioral change? Well, the calculation is, even if there isn't a behavioral change and Iran is exactly the way it is now, it is still giving the world 15 years, and it's still actually making sure that the world knows far more about the nuclear program because of the inspections. So it will still be better off 15 years from now than it is today if there is no deal. But without a doubt, there was a hope that if there was this interaction and if there was greater integration between Iran and the West, there would be slowly and surely changes in behavior. But I think the most important thing we have to remember is this. I hear a lot of people in Washington, quite justifiably and understandably, asking, after this deal, have we seen any massive change in Iranian behavior in the region? And the answer oftentimes is no. They're still supporting Hezbollah. They're still supporting Assad in Syria. They're still supporting other things and doing things that we disagree with. Let me ask you this. After 2 years of this deal, or 2 or so years of this deal, what behavior of the United States and the region has changed? Are we less supportive of the Saudis as they're committing a genocide in Yemen? Are we less supportive of other interests that we have in the region? If anything we should learn from this negotiation is that in order to get a behavioral change or policy change on the other side, it requires a policy change on our side as well. And we just have to find the right equilibrium to make sure that as they change, we change, because otherwise we're not going to live in a world in which we can just wish for others to change their behavior, but we ourselves are completely flawless.
Trita, we're just about out of time. I think there are 2 more questions over there. Can we do them real quick?
Sure.
Well, just had a couple questions with respect to, we understand how Israel was against the deal. Well, we understand how Israel was against the deal, but can you elaborate on what Saudi Arabia was doing behind the scenes to try to thwart the deal? And then I have a second question with respect to Qatar. Where does Iran figure into this constant barrage of news, rather advertisements on TV against Qatar?
All right. Thank you so much. On the first question, I want to also emphasize, yes, Netanyahu was against, and the political establishment was against. The security establishment in Israel, many key individuals were very much in favor of this deal, and they continue to speak out in favor of this deal because they believe ultimately this was good for Israel. Netanyahu is obviously different when it comes to this. The Saudis had a much less visible role when it comes to their opposition. They were making their opposition very clear to the administration, but unlike the Israelis who would come in and they would say, we want you to have far less centrifuges, you should push harder on this issue, etc. The Saudis had no opinions on the number of centrifuges, probably because they don't have a nuclear program, so they wouldn't really be able to have the technical expertise. Their problem was in some ways more honest and direct. How can you make a deal with this government in Iran? In a very naked way, saying they don't want to see any deal whatsoever at all. I would say that the Saudi opposition to the deal has become much more visible and perhaps intensified after the deal than what it was before. Netanyahu was taking the lead prior to the deal. There are certain moments in which at least the Iranians are convinced that the Saudis intervened. In November 2014, there was a final negotiation. They had a deadline. They had not extended it, and they thought that they couldn't extend it. The Iranian narrative is that they essentially came very close to a deal. The Iranian foreign minister said that he was even discussing a press release with the German foreign minister. And then Kerry took a break. He went to Vienna airport. He met in the private airplane of the Saudi foreign minister at the time. He came back, and the Iranians say that after that it was just a complete sea change, and the U.S. backed down on what he had said earlier on. The American narrative is very different. They don't believe that they were close to an agreement to begin with. And as one of the U.S. negotiators said, the Iranians looked at what happened. They looked at the meeting with the Saudi foreign minister. They took 2 + 2 and they made 5 out of it. So there's some, diverging narratives as to whether the Saudis played a role or not. But in retrospect, the Iranians are convinced that what happened that day was because the Saudis intervened. They don't know exactly what happened, but that's their conclusion. Regards to Qatar, I've been out of the country for the last couple of weeks. One of the great joys of not being in the United States is I don't see any political ads on the TVs in Europe, so I have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to the Qatar. I've heard about them, but I've not seen them, so I can't comment.
Okay. Thank you.
I would just like to ask you to comment further on the internal repercussions within Iran if Trump decides if Trump walks away from the agreement, and you can feel free to differentiate between the repercussions according to different ways of walking away.
Thank you. So one thing I think is important to understand, if the U.S. walks out of this deal, is what this would do for any future opportunities to be able to get any negotiations going between the United States and Iran. The hardliners in Iran are on the record consistently, regardless of what the United States is doing, saying you cannot trust the U.S. Even the supreme leader said, well, I'm supporting the negotiators, but he said ultimately, I think we have to be very careful because you can't trust the U.S. Well, it would be really sad if Trump does anything that would give the supreme leader the vindication of being able to say that he was right. And part of the reason for that, beyond the immediate effects of the deal collapsing and potentially putting war with Iran and an Iranian nuclear weapon back on the table, is the next time there is a need to resolve something diplomatically, those within Iran's elite, the foreign policy elite, how will they make the argument that, yes, we should go back to the negotiating table because we can strike a deal and the U.S. will live up to it? Just as much as we would have tremendous difficulty on this side. If the Iranians did cheat, if they broke away from the deal, can you imagine how difficult it would be for the next Obama to be able to make the argument, we have to pursue negotiations instead of pursuing the path of George Bush? This is really what's at stake here. It's not just about this deal. It's about the future of being able to resolve things diplomatically. But let me also say something about internal politics in Iran I think is very important. It's connected to what the previous gentleman asked about changes. I think there's been changes internally in Iran. We've seen some of them small, but very important. But they have not really been reported in the United States. So we may be forgiven for having missed them. You all heard that there were elections in Iran again. These are not free and fair elections, but they're far more competitive than almost any other elections in the Middle East. Certainly more competitive than the non-existing elections in Saudi Arabia. But what most people probably did not hear about is that in the city council level, in which the elections are actually more fair than they are at the presidential level, the reformists swept almost everything. In all the major cities, they took all of the seats. In the very conservative city of Mashhad, a woman ran for the city council, and the city council are pretty important in Iran, on the platform of opposing the patriarchy. Her slogan was, elect more women. She won. The number of women who won in the last elections, I believe, tripled or quadrupled. These are internal changes that are taking place that will speed up if there is peace between the United States and Iran and in the region as a whole. And they will certainly be trampled and undermined if we have more external tensions. So if we want to see that type of a change in their context in their foreign policy, it will ultimately have to come because Iran is also changing internally. And if we want to change internally, rest assured, threats of war, sanctions, and threats of regime change is not helping the Iranian people drive things in a democratic direction. Thank you so much.